Confirmation hearings in the US Senate are rarely funny enough to make it onto the late-night comedy shows, YouTube, or even the news. But in 2014, a guy hoping to get a job as America's ambassador to Norway made it happen.
Why on earth did President Obama nominate a guy who's never been to Norway to be the ambassador to Norway in the first place?
George Souness raised nearly $850,000 for the president's re-election campaign.
Oh.
George Souness was a hotel chain owner from New York who gave and raised money for Republicans before switching parties to support President Obama. And after winning, Obama briefly nominated Souness to be U.S. ambassador to Norway. Briefly.
Begin with a few words about Norway, the United States and Norway.
There are clips on YouTube of his Senate confirmation hearings where he didn't even know what kind of government Norway had.
Dennis Jett knows plenty about what U.S. ambassadors should know. He capped off a 28-year foreign service career by serving as an ambassador twice. And he couldn't believe how unprepared Souness was for his confirmation hearing.
There are... He didn't know what the political parties in Norway were. He didn't have any idea what American businessmen would sell in Norway.
There are a lot of markets that will continue to open up.
That's the voice of Souness, bungling his way through that confirmation hearing in 2014. And if that seems bad, the news coverage that came after was even worse.
What will likely go down as one of the most cringeworthy nomination hearings in recent memory.
I'm not sure Souness even Googled Norway. He made reference to the country's president, which, by the way, Norway does not have, and stumbled over just about everything else.
Souness in the end didn't get that Norway job, but he kept giving money to political campaigns and finally found himself a diplomatic job under President Biden as America's ambassador to Greece. It's a pretty sensitive posting. Greece is a doorstep for migrants coming to Europe from Asia and Africa, and it maintains tricky relations with its neighbor Turkey, given the two countries' history of going to war with each other. All of which might make you ask, isn't this just a terrible way to fill these jobs?
The short answer is yes. Yes, it's done anyhow. Yes, both parties do it. Is it a threat to national security? Yes. We're unique, the United States, in that we are the only country in the world that sells the title ambassador in exchange for campaign contributions.
I spoke with Ambassador Jett about this odd State Department hiring saga for kind of a complicated reason. I've been trying to make sense of an 887-page document, a detailed plan, really, that aims to overhaul how the U.S. State Department and nearly every other branch of the American federal government will operate and hire employees in 2025. The writers of this document say it'll help Donald Trump cure what ails the federal government should he win the White House this year. Critics of the plan say it will basically leave the federal government wrecked, and a lot of these critics are a little freaked out.
Blueprint outlined by Project 2025, which is a multi-million-dollar effort by Trump's allies aimed specifically at overhauling key government agencies in a potential second term.
To reshape America's balance of power by putting virtually every part of the government under the control, executive control of Trump.
The idea is to commandeer, reshape, and do away with what Republicans deride as the deep state.
This document is part of something called Project 2025, which was put together by the conservative research institution, the Heritage Foundation. And it's all part of a wider strategy being worked out by Trump allies to come into office with a huge roster of vetted applicants who are loyal to the new president's agenda. And then appoint thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands of them, to hold jobs that were formerly held by career bureaucrats and employees of the Federal Civil Service. Among other things, this massive document lays out a blueprint for what kinds of jobs these political appointees would fill, who would get fired to make way for the newcomers, and what kind of changes would take place inside agencies ranging from the Department of State, Defense, and Justice, all the way to the Departments of Treasury, Education, and Agriculture. And a lot of the coverage of this plan has so far been pretty partisan.
Here's how Donald Trump plans to end our democracy with Project 2025.
Republicans have grand visions of what 21st century America should look like.
Crackpots, insurrectionists, and weekend terrorists are laying the groundwork to turn our government into a Trumpist nightmare.
But my main questions about what might be coming are less political than they are practical. The last time Trump was president, and let's put this charitably, his choices could be hard to predict. But once you got into the weeds of policy, he was often more than happy to leave the details up to the people who'd done the homework for him. Indeed, after Trump was elected in 2016, he adopted many of the national security proposals that the Heritage Foundation had already laid out in reports that they'd published. And in the case of Project 2025, a whole lot of people have done a whole lot of homework for Trump. And I wanted to know how this homework would affect the day-to-day operations of the federal government. So I decided to zoom in on just one agency, a department whose work is important, complicated, and often takes place out of sight: the State Department. You'll hear from the person who actually wrote the State Department chapter of that 887-page document. She directed the department's storied Office of Policy Planning under President Trump. And she's got big plans for America's diplomats if Trump becomes president a second time around.
There were so many people who wiggled in to the administration thinking that they knew better than the president and that their job was to undermine. I'd like us to get back to respecting the commander-in-chief.
You'll also hear from two former U.S. ambassadors who both spent the bulk of their long careers serving in the State Department. They'll explain what the diplomats there do and what that means for you.
We're the one that keeps doors open for wheat farmers, for people producing all kinds of industrial products, for people selling services abroad, and also looking to bring goods and services into the United States.
And you'll also hear what they think is coming if the authors of the Project 2025 document get their way.
Reading that document, it sounds like a hostile takeover.
It would be kind of like the rapture. People would suddenly disappear from their desks, and there would be no one to take their place.
I'm Peter Bergen, and this is In the Room. I want to start by talking a little bit more about why the United States has a Department of State in the first place. Even back in the days of George Washington, it was pretty clear that a U.S. president couldn't handle all the work of being America's chief executive all by himself. For one thing, while Washington was at home in the capital, America needed to shake hands with other countries, to make alliances, to send messages of friendship or warning, and, of course, to help Americans buy and sell stuff overseas. So the new republic set up its first baby bureaucracy to handle foreign affairs. Back then, the department was just a Secretary of State named Thomas Jefferson, a dozen diplomats, and a handful of clerks back home. The State Department now, of course, is a lot bigger, but basically it has the same job.
And all of this is about supporting the president's agenda. There is no other role for the State Department beyond supporting a duly elected president's foreign policy agenda.
Chiron Skinner is a professor of international relations at Pepperdine University. She ran the State Department's Office of Policy Planning for about a year while Donald Trump was president. And she wrote the chapter on how to remake the State Department in that 887-page Heritage Foundation document that's causing so much ruckus right now in D.C.
I'm part of Project 2025, which is Heritage's attempt to prepare a well-ordered transition for the conservative candidate for president in 2020.
Which we presume is going to be Donald J. Trump.
Yes, and don't believe what you read in the media. This is not a scary group doing odd things. It's fully within the American tradition of using civil society participants to help organize themselves for temporary service in government.
And part of this is the lessons of 2016 when, suddenly Trump was president and there hadn't been much planning for that.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way, but you're absolutely right, Peter, in saying that we weren't really prepared to govern. I was at the campaign headquarters in New York on election night, there was a lot of surprise faces. And when it happened, there wasn't much time. That 70-odd days between the day after the election and Inauguration Day are just not enough to prepare to run one of the most complicated governments in the world and perhaps the most consequential one. So the traditional establishment Republicans did come in. They weren't in line intellectually with Trump. They weren't in line with Trump in all kinds of ways. And then a lot of the true believers didn't have the Washington or government experience that were needed. That wasn't the greatest cocktail for success on the personnel front, nor was it the greatest cocktail for policy success.
Throughout the Project 2025 game plan, you can find variations on this idea that President Trump's vision about policy got thwarted by people who thought they knew better. Some of these people were Trump's own appointees, who, like Skinner just mentioned, weren't fully aligned with Trump. But in this telling of Trump's presidency, a lot of the thwarting came from people who make a career working for the U.S. government. Civil servants, technocrats, bureaucrats, or to use one of Trump's favorite terms, the deep state.
Unelected deep state operatives who defy the voters to push their own secret agendas are truly a threat. I'm fighting the deep state. I'm fighting the swamp. It's a vicious group of people.
More than 2 million people across hundreds of agencies make up the U.S. government's more or less permanent civil service. Shrinking this federal bureaucracy has been a long-standing goal of the Heritage Foundation and the conservative movement writ large. And they've got big hopes for a president who, back in his reality TV days on The Apprentice, coined the show's most famous phrase.
Maria, you're fired. Michael, you're fired. Anand, you're fired. Go. I have no choice. You're fired.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump has said he'd reinstate an executive order from his first term called Schedule F, which would make any civil servant in a, quote, policy role easily fireable by an incoming president. Trump and his allies characterized this order as a way to get rid of a reasonable but unspecified number of uncooperative civil servants.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all. First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
It's true that every incoming presidential administration gets to replace some people at the top of federal agencies with their own appointees. Traditionally, this amounts to something like 4,000 or 5,000 new bosses and policymakers who get appointed to come in and implement a new president's vision. Exactly how many more appointees would flood into the federal government under a second Trump term is debatable. Critics who've closely read the Schedule F order think it opens the door for as many as 50,000 civil servants getting the axe after Inauguration Day.
For months now, Project 2025 has also been vetting Trump loyalists to replace career civil servants throughout the government.
This effort to basically make it so it's so much easier to fire career subject matter experts. That is an effort to make the government purely partisan and staffed with loyalists.
In Karen Skinner's chapter of the Project 2025 document, she lists a bunch of problems she says need fixing inside the State Department. But the first one she mentions on the first page is the personal politics of the department's employees. She asserts that large swaths of State Department employees harbor left-wing views that will cause them to resist the agenda of any conservative president. Back in 2020, then President Trump made a joke while introducing his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, at a press conference. The remark perhaps suggests that Trump sees diplomats the same way.
Secretary of State Pompeo is extremely busy, so if you have any question for him right now, could you do that? Because you know what I'd like to do? I'd like him to go back to the State Department, or as they call it, the Deep State Department.
In the 2025 document, you say large swaths of the State Department's workforce are left-wing and predisposed to disagree with the conservative president's policy agenda and vision.
And this is true. That's just not rhetoric. It's not that they're just left-wing. It is that they really believe so radically different. And this is a problem in our system from a conservative president, whoever he or she is, that they think they have a responsibility now to dig in and keep their point of view or wait out the president by slowing the process down. That's not how our system was designed to work.
I mean, the counter-argument to that is, you have to have some level of professional civil service, whether it's at the State Department or elsewhere.
I agree. But they need to be professional. And part of being professional is understanding that you are really there to support a president's agenda.
So give us some concrete examples, since you were there a year, of where you felt that there were very obviously people were not implementing the president's agenda.
I think it was so multifaceted, so broad-based, it's hard to point out one. What I found is that there were a lot of junior staffers who were not there for the president's agenda because no one ever told them it was their job to be. So I keep saying everything starts at the top.
But look at the Biden administration. We've had people inside the Biden administration sign letters saying that they're totally opposed to the way he's handling the Gaza situation. It's not like this is specific to Trump. Right now with Gaza, there's a huge amount of internal opposition inside the State Department to the president's policy.
Yes. And so use the dissent channel. That's why it's there.
What is the dissent channel?
It is a way in which career officials or others who work for state can dissent responsibly.
And it comes, I think, out of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And it's a great idea, except do you think Biden has paid an iota of attention to these dissent cables? No, he's just going on.
And I think these people aren't even doing this dissent channel. They're just, organizing themselves with separate letters, their resignations, and so on. I think that's actually okay. If you want to resign in protest to certain policies, no one says that you can't do that. Yeah. But what you shouldn't be doing, and which I think there's a huge liability, is to decide that you're going in a different direction policy-wise than what the president
is. And the easiest way to do that is just to slow roll things.
And just wait it out. And so I think having people, political appointees in the DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary positions, and even in junior staffers, not a bad idea. Am I saying jettison all of the careers? No, they're critical to the movement of the process.
And obviously, there's a huge pool of talent there, people who've devoted their life to Africa or devoted their life to understanding trade or counterterrorism or choose your topic, right? Institutional knowledge is important.
Right. But there are also the people who, many of them, despite their important knowledge of policy issues, have been trained up in the view that they don't have to really respect a conservative president and that they can wait him out. We need to take their great knowledge and combine it with great commitment.
Okay, so January 20th, 2025, President Trump is inaugurated. You say no one in a leadership position at the State Department on the morning of January 20th should hold that position at the end of the day. I mean, what does that look like in practice? Because you mentioned deputy assistant secretaries. That's like 5 levels down from the secretary. So, I mean, you're talking about a pretty broad purge of these people.
Yeah. I don't know that it's a purge. It's actually how things are done.
So this doesn't really differ then from the Biden transition?
It doesn't differ from what a transition should be. Why not have your people ready to go? Those positions matter too. Whether you are a front office staff assistant, a deputy assistant secretary of state, you can move machines in government. You have constituents abroad. Have your people ready to go. And I think that's what Transition 2025 is attempting to provide, a new model for conservative governance.
At the RNC, at the Republican National Committee, there's been discussion of, well, you can't work there unless you say that Trump actually won the 2020 election. I mean, are there going to be sort of litmus tests, ideological litmus tests?
No, it's going to be people who are loyal to the president and his agenda. I think that's okay. That's the same in most administrations.
But, I mean, his agenda is he's running in part on the fact that he won the last election. So, I mean, it's tricky.
I don't know that the foreign policy people are going to be asked about the 2020 election.
That's as much as Chiron Skinner said on that subject. And there's no specifics in the Heritage Foundation document about how the political loyalty of Foreign Service officers would be determined. There are also no specifics about how many people in the State Department would get fired. Skinner said she didn't have an exact number in mind.
I don't. But I will say we have talked about non-Senate confirmed positions, as many as possible. I think there will be an attempt to have political appointees ready to go. What that sheer number is, I don't know.
We're talking hundreds of people?
Probably. But this is not unusual.
But State Department veterans I spoke with believe some of Skinner's recommendations are quite unusual. One worry is that in an administration where the president isn't super focused on details, where agencies are suddenly flooded with newcomers, the Heritage Foundation's laundry list of policy changes could end up being implemented without really considering their ramifications.
There'd be a tremendous pressure to do that because the work's done, here's the list.
Dennis Jett is the U.S. ambassador you heard from at the beginning. He served nearly 3 decades in the State Department. Here's an example of one of those in-the-weeds policies he's worried about. The Heritage document argues that the new administration should immediately freeze all efforts to implement unratified treaties. It takes 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to agree and ratify a treaty. That's been a pretty rare occurrence in recent decades. And so sometimes the State Department unofficially goes along with treaties that the rest of the world has adopted because they just seem like a good idea.
The best example of that is the Law of the Sea Treaty. That is a treaty that's supported by industry because they would like to be able to have rules for exploiting the resources of the deep seabed. It's supported by the Defense Department because they would like to have rules as to what you can do in various parts of the ocean if you're a warship.
In simple terms, the Law of the Sea Treaty spells out how much control a country has over the ocean off their coast, and for how many miles out. More than 160 nations have agreed on questions like who gets to fish or drill for oil where, and how close another country's navy can get to your shores. But the U.S. Senate has never officially ratified that treaty. Jett is concerned about what kind of chaos might ensue if the U.S. suddenly decided to freeze its policy of following that treaty.
If you got no rules, then why couldn't Chinese ships and Chinese warships cruise off a couple miles off the beach or Chinese fishing vessels? Then it's a Wild West show where whoever has the biggest warship can dictate what happens in that particular spot at that particular moment. What are the rules if you say there are no rules?
And of all the recommendations for the State Department contained in that 887-page Heritage Foundation document, Jett is probably most critical of the mandate that, quote, no one in a leadership position on the morning of January 20th should hold that position at the end of the day.
You would have this wholesale turnover of people that I think do pretty important work and do pretty important jobs and do it well.
Ambassador Jett was a young Democrat living in New Mexico when he signed up to join the Foreign Service under the administration of Republican President Richard Nixon. In deciding to serve, he said the president's politics didn't ever enter his mind.
I didn't even think of it at the time, and I never considered myself particularly political. My father was a career Air Force officer. My grandfather also worked for government. So that sense of serving your country was very strong and very motivating. And everybody in the Foreign Service that I ever met recognized that the president got elected and we didn't.
Jett ranks among the rare career Foreign Service officers who worked their way up to become an ambassador. He was first tapped by President George H.W. Bush to serve as ambassador to Mozambique, and later served as ambassador to Peru under President Bill Clinton.
It's a long shot. Only about 5% of the people actually work their way up to the top and have the combination of dumb luck and hard work to become an ambassador. It's hard in the same way that all those people who go into the military as second lieutenants aren't going to be generals.
Jett is now a professor of international relations at Penn State University. He wrote a book called American Ambassadors. It's about U.S. diplomats, their history, and some of the ways he thinks the job ought to be reformed. The Constitution gives the president the power to appoint diplomats, but is otherwise vague on the details. Historically, lots of U.S. ambassadorships have been doled out to people whose main qualifications seem to be the money they donated to winning presidential candidates. Jett is a pretty understated kind of guy, the sort of person who will tell a joke and doesn't really mind if you miss it. But his contempt for the dollar diplomats is unmistakable.
We're unique. the United States, American exceptionalism at work, in that we are the only country in the world that sells the title ambassador in exchange for campaign contributions. And this is not a Democrat thing or a Republican thing. Administrations, at least as far back as Nixon, have done this. Normally, though, in a normal presidency, it's 30% political appointees that are ambassadors and 70% career people like I was in Peru and Mozambique. When you're a political appointee, there are basically three reasons. You're either a friend of the president. George W. Bush appointed a lot of people from Skull and Bones, his secret club at Yale. There's a political reason, former senator who you owe a favor to, or it's campaign cash. You wrote a big check. And a colleague and I did a paper a number of years back calculating what it cost to go to London versus what it cost to go to Lisbon.
A plum ambassadorial posting like London, Jet says, can cost a campaign contributor more than $1 million. For Lisbon, you're only looking at a few $100,000.
Lisbon is a bargain, by the way, much cheaper. What I love is these people who say, I want to serve my country and I want to go to Brussels or I want to go to Copenhagen, I want to go to Stockholm. Well, why don't you serve your country in Uzbekistan? You know, I'm underwhelmed by their spirit of sacrifice. Let's put it that way.
Jet has plenty of specific practical objections to Project 2025's plan for the State Department. But maybe the main one is this. He thinks that replacing even more career Foreign Service people with political appointees will make the problem of unqualified amateurs getting into important diplomatic jobs much, much worse.
I'm not saying you shouldn't have political leadership at the top, but to have this wholesale turnover would be one way to make America totally irrelevant in the world and make our government basically dysfunctional.
Then there's also the issue of how long this wholesale turnover would take and how long those new roles for political appointees might remain vacant. Because working at the State Department isn't like just getting a job at the post office. In addition to extensive background checks, you also need a high-level security clearance.
All of those positions that you're talking about require a top-secret clearance. And so to get a top-secret clearance, it takes months to do the background investigation. You're looking for things like, does this person have financial problems that makes him or her susceptible to being bribed by foreign agents, or does this person have a criminal record? I don't know how you get over the clearance problems.
And just in case you think this critique of Project 2025 is a purely partisan thing, I spoke to another ambassador who's got a lot of similar practical concerns. His name is Tom Shannon. He served in the State Department under Donald Trump. He said he first registered to vote as a Republican back in the 1970s. And then he registered with no party for the duration of his 35-year Foreign Service career. And he currently describes himself as being, quote, without party. Shannon is also worried about the consequences of mass firings.
I can tell you from my experience in the first Trump administration that the tensions between the Secretary of State and the Office of Personnel at the White House will ensure that the movement of political appointees into an institution like the Department of State will be slow because of security clearances, because of disputes over their political backgrounds, because of concerns about what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And the bottom line is that you can end up with, similar to what happened in the first term, a lack of people in important jobs that harms the ability of the United States to get its job done.
Shannon's 3-decade career at the State Department spanned 6 U.S. presidents. Under President Trump, he held the department's third highest job, Under Secretary of State. And for a few days in 2017, right at the beginning of the Trump administration, he even served as acting boss of the whole department.
12 days.
How was that?
12 days. Well, the Republic trembled at the thought.
Tom Shannon ranks among the rare and exceptionally distinguished Foreign Service officers who are awarded the title Career Ambassador.
Well, it was a tremendous honor. It's our highest rank.
Career Ambassador, is that another person's deep state?
You know, the deep state's a fascinating concept because at one level it exists, but it exists not in terms of individuals. It exists in terms of American national interests and how our national security organizations are structured around the world. Because we are not a country that reshapes itself every 4 years. We are a country that has profound interests all around the globe, and we've built a larger intelligence network, military network, diplomatic network that are all designed to address these interests that have, over time, been confirmed by one president after another. And so when each president comes into office, he or she eventually is faced with a world that has been built for them. And their job is to oversee it, fine-tune it, but keep it running. And if you wanted to talk about a deep state, that's it. It's the United States in the world.
And so this gets to kind of the point of the episode we're doing, which we're focusing on the State Department. The Trump administration has a plan to basically, there'll be far more political appointees, not only in the State Department, but also in the federal government. There are 4,000 political appointees in the federal government. This new plan, the estimate is there would be 50,000. Now, it seems in particular at the State Department where if you're an expert on, let's say, Uzbekistan, this is not something you become an expert on overnight. So what would the practical effect of really upping the number of political appointees, et cetera?
Well, number one, this would become a jobs program. And we'd be returning to a period of time in the late 19th century before our professionalization of our civil service and before the professionalization of our foreign service. And once you breach a wall, like in the Department of State, what's to stop you from doing the same in the intelligence community? What will stop you from doing something similar within the civilian service of the Department of Defense? Among the core groups of our national security agencies who have spent decades building expertise that really can't be replicated, which doesn't mean that there aren't smart people who know a lot about foreign affairs, but they don't have the granular experience of operating in a complex bureaucracy and making things happen over time.
Shannon and other diplomats share the worry about the sheer number of people who'd be affected if Donald Trump fires everyone in a leadership position right after the inauguration. Diplomats I've talked to say there's at least 300 jobs at the State Department headquarters in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. that are likely senior enough to be considered leadership jobs. Throw in those leaders' aides and assistants and that number more than doubles. Internationally, there are 195 ambassadors, and then right below them, there are another 195 deputy chiefs of mission. Put that all together, and it adds up to a whole lot of empty chairs.
It would be kind of like the rapture. People would suddenly disappear from their desks, and there would be no one to take their place because you just can't put people into government that quickly. The mechanism doesn't exist to do that. And so if you want a national security agency in which no one is present, then try to do that.
And Shannon says what happens at the State Department isn't just about treaties and abstract policies. It also affects you anytime you travel overseas.
For Americans traveling abroad, the State Department is what protects you. Should you be arrested? Should you be injured? Should you pass away? It's the Department of State that will take care of you, first and foremost.
And American diplomacy can affect you even if you don't cross a border at all. A farmer in Nebraska or Louisiana can't just decide to sell their crops in Bangladesh. And those affordable Bangladeshi-made kids' clothes that you find on the rack at Walmart or the Gap, they didn't just get there without lots of complex trade agreements.
We're the one that keeps doors open for cattlemen, for wheat farmers, for people producing all kinds of industrial products. We are the ones who keep the doors open for people selling services abroad and also looking to bring goods and services into the United States.
It's only worth gaming out what practical effects the Project 2025 recommendations might have on the State Department. But much of what happens to U.S. foreign policy in a possible second Trump term would likely also come down to Trump himself. And Shannon's experience in this regard is instructive.
How many times were you in the room with President Trump?
I lost count, but I was in all the early meetings that President Trump, beginning with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, through any number of others.
Did he learn over time?
Yeah, certainly. But he's highly personalistic. He's very focused on the person sitting across the table from him. He is very much driven by the idea that leaders lead, commanders command. And his purpose was not necessarily to understand kind of the broad strategic stretch of an issue. It was to understand who you are as a leader, what you want from him, and to express what he wants from you, and then to see whether or not a deal can be done. President Trump was not a person who was easily briefed. He had an inquisitive mind, sharp opinions and ideas about what could be done or needed to be done. And briefing was more an interactive process. In other words, if you walked into a room thinking you were going to talk to him, you were mistaken. He was going to speak with you, and you were going to respond.
So what kind of questions would he ask?
You have to remember, his connection to the world of national security was limited. And so he was constantly amazed and surprised by the nature of U.S. security commitments around the world, where we had troops, where we had embassies, where we had consulates, where we had Americans who in one way or another were doing the nation's bidding. And he had lots of questions about why we were there. What was the purpose? And especially if he thought that it exposed us in a way that could lead to attack or could draw us into some kind of conflict.
What do you make of him personally?
He was president of the United States. He was chosen by the American people and our institutions. And as such, he's someone who has to be respected. His style of leadership, for those of us who had grown up in a certain ambiance, was unusual and sometimes shocking. And I often found myself disagreeing with the decisions that he and the people around him made. But at the same time, he's an iconoclast, and he's an accelerant of change, and he understands that. And I found that the people who worked best with him realized that he was not going to be directed or tamed. He could just be channeled. And I have to say that in the aftermath of this experience, I came away with much greater respect for Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell.
Why was that?
Well, as Henry VIII's chancellors, they also were dealing with a hyperactive and intelligent leader who was also very dangerous.
Shannon retired from the State Department in 2018 and now works at a private law firm. The media coverage framed his departure as a heavy blow to a beleaguered agency.
Didn't your mother say it was the right time to leave when you left the Trump administration?
She did indeed.
What did she say?
My mother died in November of 2017.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And I announced my retirement in February of 2018, but she and I had many conversations about the Trump administration and my role in the Department of State. And it was her opinion that, as she told me once, one man cannot save an institution. An institution has to save itself. And that I had done all that I could possibly do for the Foreign Service and the Department of State. I needed to think about myself more and the institution less. She was a good mother.
And what prompted her to make these observations?
She believed we were in a twilight struggle for our democracy. She was not a fan of the president. And she made that clear.
You worked at the State Department for 35 years, and Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, once referred to you as a walking encyclopedia at state. And yet people outside may not know your name. How do you feel about that? What does it say about the mission of the State Department in general?
I'm very happy to be an anonymous citizen. Celebrity is never something that I have sought. What I have sought was service to my country.
Are there legitimate reforms of the State Department that are needed?
Always. Always. Remember, we reflect a 19th century vision of the world as made up of nation states. But we live in a world that is globalized economically and socially. And so the nature of power is shifting. Increasingly, power is technology or access to technology. And the Department of State is an enormously capable place. But we don't have the scientific and technological expertise that's going to be needed as we go deeper into the 21st century.
But that's very different from saying it's a largely left-wing organization that needs to be reformed by having most of its top officials depart.
Because that's not a true reflection of what the Department of State is.
In her portion of that 887-page Heritage Foundation document, Chiron Skinner seems to disagree pretty strongly. She describes the department as being too left-leaning and badly in need of change via a big infusion of new blood. And she says she didn't write the chapter in hope of being part of that unspecified number of new political appointees to state.
I did not. I know people are campaigning for cabinet positions. I just never have done that. I wouldn't even know how to do it. If you have any advice on how to do that, please share it with me.
Don't shoot your dog.
I'm not. So, but I'm happy to serve in the ways that I can.
Skinner says she's confident that the more drastic-seeming recommendations will be implemented in a reasonable way. She thinks this is true whether you're talking about the really visible stuff, like the firing of career diplomats, or the more obscure stuff, like putting a freeze on the U.S. following the Law of the Sea Treaty.
I don't think anyone would be reading what's in the State Department chapter and saying, oh my God, January 20th, 12:05 p.m., this agreement is dead. Our system doesn't quite work that way. I think the way I would expect them to read what we've written is to say that I'm going to have to make my case to the American public. I'm going to have to work really hard with my counterparts to make the case that my national interest matches with yours. I've been saying this to a number of Europeans.
They're reaching out to you because they're pretty sure a Trump administration is coming in, or what?
They want to get clarity.
Skinner's big picture argument and the big picture argument of the other authors of the many other chapters of that 887-page document is that an electorate voting for Trump would be voting for big change. And so big changes would need to happen throughout the federal government.
So when you get a cabinet official, and I hope some prospective ones are listening to this important podcast that you do, they need to understand there's a genius. There's political artistry in getting elected. Give the guy or gal some credit. Someone is figuring out the American electorate. Someone is figuring out what the issues are that connect with people. And I think in the Trump case, he was listening to them and they were listening to him.
But I think the point that veteran diplomats like Tom Shannon are making is that they see themselves as serving the voters too. But they're serving voters in a complicated world, doing complicated work, like learning obscure foreign languages or understanding complex ocean treaties, and that messing too much with the machinery of diplomacy can have higher stakes than you might think.
To the average person in, say, Nebraska, Louisiana, pick your American state, what is the purpose of the State Department? What does it do for the American people?
Well, let me tell you a story. When I was confirmed as Undersecretary of State, shortly afterwards traveled to Northern Africa to engage with partners there on some counterterrorism programs, which were to the obvious benefit of the United States and the American people. But at the time, I went to Carthage, and I visited the cemetery there of North American war dead from World War II. All the Americans and Canadians who had been killed fighting the German army were buried there. Thousands and thousands of young men, mostly between the ages of 18 and 26. And the director of the cemetery had a little trick he liked to play on people who had common names, such as myself. He came to me and he said, "Mr. Shannon, I would like to show you your grave." And he took me to the grave of a soldier named Thomas Shannon. And it was a striking moment because although it wasn't me, it could have been. And what I learned from that time at the North American Cemetery outside of Carthage was that almost everybody in that graveyard, 4 years before they were killed, had no idea that they were going to fight the Germans in North Africa. They had no idea the Germans were going to kill them. And they had no idea that their mortal remains were going to stay in Northern Africa for the rest of eternity. And what I mean by this is that history reaches out and touches you in ways you don't expect. And in the kind of world we live in today, we need to be vitally aware of everything that is happening around us. We need to understand what we have to do to promote our interests, what we have to do to protect ourselves, and what we need to do to keep the peace. And so I would argue that for the greater American public, you have no better servant than your Foreign Service officer. You have no greater American than the women and men of the United States Department of State who will go anywhere in the world armed only with a smile and a handshake on behalf of the United States.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to know some more about the topics we discussed, I recommend the book American Ambassadors, A Guide for Aspiring Diplomats and Foreign Service Officers by Dennis Jett. It's available on Audible. In the Room with Peter Bergen is an Audible original, produced by Audible Studios and Fresh Produce Media. This episode was produced by Eric German with help from Nathan Ray. Our executive producer is Alison Craiglow. Katie McMurrin is our technical director. Our staff also includes Alexandra Salomon, Laura Tillman, Luke Cregan, Holly DeMuth, Sandy Malera, and JP Swenson. Our theme music is by Joel Picard. Our executive producers for Fresh Produce Media are Colin Moore and Jason Ross. Our head of development is Julian Ambler. Our head of production is Eleanor Bavietz. Maureen Traynor is our head of operations. Our production manager is Herminio Ochoa. Our production coordinator is Henry Koch. And our delivery coordinator is Ana Paula Martinez. Audible's chief content officer is Rachel Giazza. Head of content acquisition and development and partnerships, Pat Shah. Audible executive producer, Lara Regan Kleinschmidt. Special thanks to Marlon Calby, Allison Weber, and Vanessa Harris. Copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC. Sound recording copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC.